We live with a persistent and flattering illusion, the belief that we are the sole architects of our own minds. We like to think that our thoughts, our moods, our resilience, and our ambitions are generated entirely from within, that they are the products of our own sovereign will. But there is a biological, psychological, and even mathematical reality that contradicts this. We are not islands. We are permeable vessels. In the field of neuroscience, we speak of mirror neurons, mechanisms in the brain that allow us to simulate the actions and emotions of others. This is the root of empathy, the glue of civilization. But it is also a profound vulnerability. It means that the people you allow into your immediate orbit are not just bystanders to your life, they are active contributors to your neural architecture. When you sit across from someone, you are not just exchanging words, you are exchanging physiological states. If they are anxious, your cortisol levels rise. If they are cynical, your dopamine response to new ideas is dampened. You are quite literally outsourcing the regulation of your nervous system to the people around you. The ancient Stoics understood this danger intuitively, long before we had fMRI scans to prove it. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and philosopher, wrote extensively about the concept of the inner citadel, the fortress of the mind that must be protected at all costs. He realized that you cannot live a virtuous, tranquil, and effective life if the gates of that citadel are left wide open to those who bring nothing but disturbance, chaos, and degradation. Yet in our modern world, we often lack this discipline. We allow our social circles to form by accident rather than by design. We hold on to relationships out of habit, out of a misplaced sense of loyalty, or simply because we are afraid of the awkwardness of letting go. We drift through life, accumulating people like barnacles on the hull of a ship, unaware that this accumulation is creating drag, slowing us down, and eventually steering us off course entirely. There is a fascinating body of research by sociologists Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler regarding social networks. They found that phenomena like obesity, smoking, and even happiness are contagious, spreading through social networks up to 3 degrees of separation. This means that if your friend's friend is chronically negative, that negativity has a statistical probability of infecting you. This challenges our very concept of free will. It suggests that you are not just a singular entity, but a node in a network, and the health of that node is dependent on the health of the connections surrounding it. If this is true, and the data suggests it is, then the act of curating your social environment is not a superficial exercise in popularity. It is perhaps the most critical decision you can make for your mental and physical health.
It is an act of survival. So we must ask ourselves a difficult question. If life is finite, as Seneca reminded us in On the Shortness of Life, why do we squander so much of it managing the pathologies of others? Why do we voluntarily drink from poisoned wells? Today I want to explore the concept of social pruning. We are going to examine specific archetypes of human behavior, patterns of interaction that are distinct, recognizable, and deeply harmful. These are not necessarily bad people in a moral sense. Many are struggling with their own demons, but they are people whose behavioral patterns are incompatible with your growth, your peace, and your search for meaning. We will look at who they are, how they operate on your psychology, and why, for the sake of your own potential, you must find the courage to distance yourself from them. This is a conversation about reclaiming the sovereignty of your own mind. We must begin our examination of social pruning with a figure that is ubiquitous and deceptively dangerous: the chronic complainer, often colloquially referred to as the energy vampire. It is crucial to draw a sharp line here between a friend in crisis and the archetype we are discussing. True friendship requires us to bear witness to suffering, to offer support during grief or failure. That is the essence of empathy. But the chronic complainer operates on a different frequency entirely. For them, negativity is not a temporary reaction to a bad event, it is a permanent mode of existence. They view the world through a lens of victimization, where everything is happening to them and they are powerless to change it. When they come to you, they are not seeking a solution. nor are they looking for a new perspective. They're looking for an emotional landfill. They dump the radioactive waste of their unchecked frustrations onto your psyche, only to walk away lighter, leaving you to process the toxicity they refuse to manage themselves. The cost of this interaction is not just annoyance, it is biologically expensive. Neuroscience tells us that the human brain is a social organ, wired for connection through mirror neurons. These neurons allow us to simulate the experience of others, to understand them. However, when you are constantly exposed to someone who is anxious, angry, or cynical, your brain involuntarily simulates those states. You catch their emotions, just as you would catch a virus. Research by Robert Sapolsky and others in stress physiology indicates that secondhand stress triggers the release of cortisol in your own bloodstream. This means that by simply listening to a chronic complainer for an hour, you are bathing your own hippocampus, the center of memory and learning, in neurotoxic chemicals. You are physically degrading your own cognitive hardware and conditioning your amygdala to be more reactive to threats. You are, in a very literal sense, sacrificing your biological peace to sustain their pathology. From a philosophical standpoint, tolerating this dynamic is often a failure of self-respect disguised as kindness. We tell ourselves we are being good people by listening, but the Stoics would argue we are merely lacking the discipline to protect our inner citadel. By allowing someone to repeatedly violate your peace without demanding they take ownership of their life, you are not helping them. You are enabling a cycle of helplessness. You validate the narrative that complaining is a viable strategy for dealing with life, rather than taking action. Seneca famously wrote about the value of time, noting that we protect our property with aggression, yet we let others trespass on our time, our life's most finite resource, with ease. Every hour spent circling the drain of redundant negativity is an hour stolen from your own growth, your creativity, or from relationships that are actually reciprocal and nourishing. Ultimately, the most compassionate thing you can do for both yourself and the complainer is to step back. You must realize that you cannot save someone who is committed to their own misery. If their identity is built on being a victim, your attempts to fix their problems will be met with resistance, because a solution threatens their identity. You have to love them from a distance. You have to establish a boundary that says, I care about you, but I cannot be the vessel for your unprocessed emotions. This silence might feel harsh, but it is often the only thing that forces them to confront the reality of their situation. By closing the gate, you preserve your energy for the things you can actually control, and you stop being an accomplice to a life wasted on complaint. As we navigate the social landscape further, we encounter a figure that is perhaps even more insidious than the complainer, because their damage is often inflicted under the guise of protection or being realistic. The dream killer, or the inveterate cynic. This is the person who, the moment you articulate a new ambition, a tentative hope, or a vision for a future that is different from your present, immediately seeks to dismantle it. They don't necessarily do this with open hostility. Often it is a subtle, corrosive skepticism. They might say, the market is too saturated, or most businesses fail within the first year, or are you sure you're talented enough for that? On the surface, these sound like pragmatic warnings, but if you listen closely to the frequency of their signal, you realize it isn't grounded in objective analysis. It is grounded in fear. And specifically, it is grounded in their fear, which they are projecting on the blank canvas of your potential. Psychologically, what is happening here is a defense mechanism best described by the crab bucket theory. If you put a single crab in a bucket, it can easily crawl out. But if you put a group of crabs in, the moment one tries to escape, the others will pull it back down. This isn't because they want to escape too, it's because the collective stays safe in the known misery of the bucket. When you announce an intention to grow, whether it's getting in shape, starting a venture, or changing your philosophy, you are implicitly challenging the status quo of your peer group. Your attempt to elevation acts as a mirror, reflecting their own stagnation. If you succeed, it proves that their limitations were self-imposed, that they could have done it too but chose not to. That is a painful psychological reality to confront. So to avoid that pain, the dream killer tries to ensure you never leave the bucket. They act as the guardians of mediocrity, convincing you that the walls are unclimbable so that they don't have to face the fact that they never tried to climb. From a neuroscientific perspective, the danger of the dream killer lies in how they hijack your brain's reward system, specifically the dopamine pathways. We often think of dopamine as the chemical of pleasure, but it is actually the chemical of anticipation and motivation. It is the fuel that drives us to pursue long-term goals. When you visualize a goal, your brain releases dopamine to propel you toward it. However, this system is fragile, especially in the early stages of a new endeavor. When a cynic introduces doubt, what we might call a prediction error in the negative direction, it can effectively shut down that dopamine release. By framing the outcome as impossible or painful, they trigger your brain's aversion systems. You start to associate your goal not with the excitement of reward, but with the fear of social humiliation or wasted effort. Over time, if you are surrounded by these voices, you develop learned helplessness. You stop trying, not because you lack ability, but because your neural pathways have been conditioned to believe that effort does not lead to outcome. There is a profound historical dimension to this as well. Think of the great innovators who shifted the paradigm of human existence. Almost every single one of them was surrounded by a chorus of voices telling them they were insane, that it couldn't be done. If the Wright brothers had listened to the leading physicists of their time, we wouldn't have flight. The Synod operates from a framework of the past. They rely on historical data to predict the future, but the visionary operates from the framework of the possible. As the philosopher Kierkegaard might suggest, the cynic is trapped in the finite, obsessed with limitations, while the creator is reaching for the infinite. You cannot explore the infinite if you are tethered to someone who is terrified of leaving the finite. This is why silence is often prescribed by the wise when embarking on a new path. You must learn to identify these people and realize that their skepticism is not a verdict on your capability, it is a confession of their own limitations. You have to leave them at base camp because the view from the summit is reserved for those who were willing to believe in what they couldn't yet see. We must now turn our attention to a figure that operates with a far more calculated and darker intent than those we have discussed previously: the manipulator. While the complainer drains you through incompetence and the cynic through fear, the manipulator drains you through design. This is the individual who views human relationships not as bonds of mutual respect, but as transactional games of chess where you are merely a pawn to be positioned for their benefit. They are often masters of disguise, capable of appearing charming, vulnerable, or authoritative depending on what the situation requires. But the defining characteristic of their interaction with you is that there is always a hidden cost. They do not ask for favors, they engineer situations where you feel ethically or emotionally obligated to provide them. They weaponize your own empathy against you, using guilt, obligation, and subtle shaming to erode your boundaries until you find yourself living a life that is servicing their needs rather than your own. The cost of this interaction is not just annoyance, it is biologically expensive. Neuroscience tells us that the human brain is a social organ, wired for connection through mirror neurons. These neurons allow us to simulate the experience of others, to understand them. However, when you are constantly exposed to someone who is anxious, angry, or cynical, your brain involuntarily simulates those states. You catch their emotions, just as you would catch a virus.
Because a solution threatens their identity, you have to love them from a distance. You have to establish a boundary that says, I care about you, but I cannot be the vessel for your unprocessed emotions. This silence might feel harsh, but it is often the only thing that forces them to confront the reality of their situation. By closing the gate, you preserve your energy for the things you can actually control, and you stop being an accomplice to a life wasted on complaint. As we navigate the social landscape further, we encounter a figure that is perhaps even more insidious than the complainer, because their damage is often inflicted under the guise of protection or being realistic: the dream killer or the inveterate cynic. This is the person who, the moment you articulate a new ambition, a tentative hope, or a vision for a future that is different from your present, immediately seeks to dismantle it. They don't necessarily do this with open hostility. Often it is a subtle, corrosive skepticism. They might say, the market is too saturated, or most businesses fail within the first year, or are you sure you're talented enough for that? On the surface, these sound like pragmatic warnings, but if you listen closely to the frequency of their signal, you realize it isn't grounded in objective analysis, it is grounded in fear. And specifically, it is grounded in their fear, which they are projecting onto the blank canvas of your potential. Psychologically, what is happening here is a defense mechanism best described by the crab bucket theory. If you put a single crab in a bucket, it can easily crawl out. But if you put a group of crabs in, the moment one tries to escape, the others will pull it back down. This isn't because they want to escape too, it's because the collective stays safe in the known misery of the bucket. When you announce an intention to grow, whether it's getting in shape, starting a venture, or changing your philosophy, you are implicitly challenging the status quo of your peer group. Your attempt at elevation acts as a mirror reflecting their own stagnation. If you succeed, it proves that their limitations were self-imposed, that they could have done it too, but chose not to. That is a painful psychological reality to confront. So to avoid that pain, the dream killer tries to ensure you never leave the bucket. They act as the guardians of mediocrity, convincing you that the walls are unclimbable, so that they don't have to face the fact that they never tried to climb. From a neuroscientific perspective, the danger of the dream killer lies in how they hijack your brain's reward system, specifically the dopamine pathways. We often think of dopamine as the chemical of pleasure, but it is actually the chemical of anticipation and motivation. It is the fuel that drives us to pursue long-term goals. When you visualize a goal, your brain releases dopamine to propel you toward it. However, this system is fragile, especially in the early stages of a new endeavor. When a cynic introduces doubt, what we might call a prediction error in the negative direction, it can effectively shut down that dopamine release. By framing the outcome as impossible or painful, they trigger your brain's aversion systems. You start to associate your goal not with the excitement of reward, but with the fear of social humiliation or wasted effort. Over time, if you were surrounded by these voices, you developed learned helplessness. You stopped trying, not because you lack ability, but because your neural pathways have been conditioned to believe that effort does not lead to outcome. There is a profound historical dimension to this as well. Think of the great innovators who shifted the paradigm of human existence. Almost every single one of them was surrounded by a chorus of voices telling them they were insane, that it couldn't be done. If the Wright brothers had listened to the leading physicists of their time, we wouldn't have flight. The cynic operates from a framework of the past. They rely on historical data to predict the future, but the visionary operates from the framework of the possible. As the philosopher Kierkegaard might suggest, the cynic is trapped in the finite, obsessed with limitations, while the creator is reaching for the infinite. You cannot explore the infinite if you are tethered to someone who is terrified of leaving the finite. This is why silence is often prescribed by the wise when embarking on a new path. You must learn to identify these people and realize that their skepticism is not a verdict on your capability. It is a confession of their own limitations. You have to leave them at base camp because the view from the summit is reserved for those who are willing to believe in what they couldn't yet see. We must now turn our attention to a figure that operates with a far more calculated and darker intent than those we have discussed previously, the manipulator. While the complainer drains you through incompetence and the cynic through fear, the manipulator drains you through design. This is the individual who views human relationships not as bonds of mutual respect, but as transactional games of chess where you are merely a pawn to be positioned for their benefit. They are often masters of disguise,
capable of appearing charming, vulnerable, or authoritative, depending on what the situation requires. But the defining characteristic of their interaction with you is that there is always a hidden cost. They do not ask for favors, they engineer situations where you feel ethically or emotionally obligated to provide them. They weaponize your own empathy against you, using guilt, obligation, and subtle shaming to erode your boundaries until you find yourself living a life that is servicing their needs rather than your own. The neuroscience behind why we stay in relationships with manipulators is fascinating and disturbing, largely centering on a concept known as intermittent reinforcement. This was observed by the psychologist B.F. Skinner in his famous experiments. If a rat presses a lever and gets a pellet of food every single time, it only presses it when hungry. But if the lever only provides food sometimes, unpredictably, the rat becomes obsessed, pressing the lever incessantly. The manipulator intuitively understands this mechanism. If they were cruel 100% of the time, you would leave immediately. So they aren't. They alternate between moments of intense affection, praise, and love bombing, and moments of coldness, criticism, or withdrawal.
This unpredictability hacks your brain's dopamine system. You become chemically addicted to the high of their approval because it is so scarce and unpredictable. You find yourself walking on eggshells, constantly modulating your behavior to try and trigger that positive response again. It is a cycle that can break even the strongest will because it bypasses your logic and targets your primal reward circuitry. Furthermore, the manipulator often employs a psychological tactic known as gaslighting, which is a direct assault on your perception of reality. When you attempt to confront them about their behavior or hold them accountable, they will deny the event occurred, insist you were too sensitive, or twist the narrative so that you end up apologizing for their transgression. This induces a state of cognitive dissonance, a mental conflict where your reality clashes with the version they're imposing on you. Over time, this erodes your trust in your own judgment. You stop believing your own eyes and ears. You become reliant on them to interpret reality for you. This is the ultimate loss of sovereignty. As the philosopher Hannah Arendt noted, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists. On a personal level, the manipulator seeks to establish a totalitarian regime over your mind, where their version of the truth is the only one that matters. From an ethical standpoint, the manipulator violates the fundamental categorical imperative proposed by Immanuel Kant that we must treat humanity, whether in ourselves or in others, always as an end in itself and never merely as a means to an end. To the manipulator, you are a means, you are a tool, a resource, an extension of their ego. They are incapable of seeing you as a separate, autonomous being with your own desires and rights. This objectification is spiritually corrosive. You cannot have a genuine connection with someone who does not see you as a person, but as a utility. To reclaim your life, you must recognize that this dynamic is not complicated love or friendship with ups and downs. It is exploitation. The only way to win the game against a manipulator is to refuse to play. You must cut the cord, not just for your peace of mind, but to restore your faith in your own perception of the world. You must return to a reality where a no is a no, where truth is objective, and where kindness is given freely, not as a down payment for future servitude. We move now to a quieter, yet deeply destructive presence in your life, often revealed not by what they say, but by their silence. The envious, or the person who simply refuses to clap when you win. This archetype is particularly painful because they often masquerade as close friends or supporters until the moment of your elevation. When you share a failure, they are right there with comfort because your failure feels safe to them. It reinforces the stability of the hierarchy. But when you succeed, when you get the promotion, lose the weight, or find the partner, their reaction is a masterclass in microaggression. You might see a flash of disappointment in their eyes before the forced smile appears. Or they might immediately pivot the conversation to someone else who did it better. Or perhaps they offer a backhanded compliment like, "You're so lucky," subtly attributing your hard work to chance. This behavior is not just rude, it is a signal that they view your ascent is their decline. To understand this, we have to look at the evolutionary psychology of status. For millions of years, humans lived in small tribes where resources were finite. If you got the best piece of meat or the highest mate value, it mathematically meant less for me. We evolved with a zero-sum bias deeply hardwired into our amygdala. For the envious person, this primitive circuitry is overactive. They cannot conceptualize success as a non-rivalous good. They cannot see that your light does not dim their own. Instead, they suffer from what sociologists call relative deprivation. It doesn't matter how well they are doing objectively. If you are doing better, they feel a stinging sense of loss. Neuroscience studies using fMRI have actually shown that when an envious person witnesses the success of a peer, the anterior cingulate cortex, the region of the brain associated with physical pain, lights up. Your joy is literally hurting them. And because humans are motivated to avoid pain, they will unconsciously or consciously try to sabotage your success or minimize your achievements to stop that neural firing. The philosophical danger of keeping the envious in your inner circle is that they force you to engage in self-diminishment. To maintain the relationship and avoid triggering their insecurity, you start to hide your wins, you downplay your ambition, you speak in self-deprecating terms. Over time, this becomes a habit, and then it becomes a personality trait. You internalize the idea that shining too bright is dangerous. This is often referred to in Australian culture as tall poppy syndrome, the cultural impulse to cut down the flower that grows higher than the rest. By surrounding yourself with people who hold the shears, you are agreeing to stunt your own growth. Nietzsche wrote extensively about this in his concept of ressentiment. He described a toxic form of resentment where the weak detest the strong, not because the strong are evil, but because the strong remind them of their own inadequacy. The envious person does not want to rise to your level. They want to drag you down to theirs, so the contrast is no longer painful to look at. In contrast, you need to seek out people who are capable of what the Buddhists call mudda, or sympathetic joy, the ability to feel unadulterated happiness for the success of others. This is a higher-order cognitive function. It requires a person to have transcended their primitive scarcity mindset and to have a secure sense of self-worth that is not dependent on external ranking. When you remove the envious from your life, you are not just removing negative energy, you are removing the ceiling on your own potential. You are giving yourself permission to excel without guilt. You free yourself from the exhausting labor of managing someone else's insecurity. It is a tragedy to lose a friend, but it is a greater tragedy to lose yourself because you were afraid to outgrow a room that became too small for you. We must now confront a character whose toxicity is often underestimated because it arrives wrapped in the guise of insider information or social bonding, the gossip, or what ancient traditions called the carrier of tales. There's a seduction to this dynamic. When someone leans in to whisper a secret about a colleague, a friend, or a family member, it triggers an immediate primal sense of inclusion. It feels like intimacy.
It signals, I trust you enough to share this forbidden knowledge, and you and I are on the inside while they are on the outside. However, this is a counterfeit intimacy. The golden rule of this archetype is immutable and mathematically certain. If they're gossiping to you, they are gossiping about you. The moment you leave the room, you become the currency they use to purchase the attention of the next person. They are not loyal to people, they are loyal to the dopamine rush of being the center of information. From an evolutionary and anthropological perspective, language evolved partially to facilitate social grooming, a way to maintain larger groups than primates could by physically picking bugs off each other. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar suggests that gossip is the human equivalent of this grooming. It maps the social hierarchy. However, the malicious gossip has weaponized this mechanism. They traffic in reputational destruction. When you engage with them, you're entering a high-risk contract. You are handing over your vulnerability to someone who has already demonstrated a lack of discretion. Neuroscientifically, listening to gossip engages the reward centers of the brain, but it also triggers the suspicion systems. Deep down, your brain knows that a violation of privacy is occurring. This creates a background hum of anxiety in the relationship. You can never truly be authentic or vulnerable with a gossip because you are constantly calculating, how will this be retold? How will this be twisted? This constant vigilance is cognitively exhausting and prevents the formation of deep restorative bonds known as secure attachment. Philosophically, the gossip represents a fundamental failure of speech. The Greek philosopher Socrates is often attributed with the test of three, a filter for communication. Before speaking, one must ask, is it true? Is it good? Is it useful? The gossip fails all three. They traffic in half-truths, they spread malice rather than goodness, and their utility is destructive rather than constructive. By participating in their conversation, even as a passive listener, you are complicit in the erosion of truth. You are validating a culture where absent people are put on trial without a defense. There is a metaphysical weight to this. Words create reality. When you speak ill of others or listen to it, you are polluting your own perception of the social world. You start to see enemies everywhere. You start to project treachery onto others because you are swimming in a sea of it. Furthermore, the presence of a gossip in your life acts as a repellent to high-quality people. Individuals of integrity, those who are focused on ideas, growth, and the good life, generally have a low tolerance for petty malice. If you are known to associate closely with a chronic gossip, you are guilty by association. You signal to the world that you tolerate the violation of privacy. To curate a life of meaningful connection, you must excise the carrier of tales. You must cultivate a reputation as a dead end for rumors, a place where secrets go to die, not to be distributed. When you stop feeding the gossip your attention, they will move on to a more willing host, leaving you with the silence and safety necessary to build relationships based on presence rather than absence, and honor rather than exposure. We now arrive at a character who teaches us a harsh lesson about the physics of human connection, specifically regarding the law of reciprocity, the opportunist, often recognized as the fair-weather friend. This is the individual whose presence in your life is entirely conditional on your utility to them. They possess a radar for your resources, whether that resource is your money, your social status, your professional network, or simply your time, and they appear with remarkable timing whenever they have a deficit they need you to fill. However, the moment the dynamic shifts, the moment you are the one in need of support, a ride to the airport, or a listening ear during a crisis, they vanish into the ether. They are the ghosts of your social circle, present for the feast, but absent for the cleanup. The tragedy of this relationship is its profound asymmetry. You view them through the lens of friendship, a bond based on mutual care, while they view you through the lens of extraction, a bond based on what can be harvested. From an evolutionary biology perspective, this behavior triggers a very specific alarm system in the human brain. Evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers developed the theory of reciprocal altruism, which suggests that cooperation among non-kin evolved because it conferred a survival advantage, provided that favors were returned to protect against exploitation. Humans evolved what evolutionary psychologists call a cheater detection module. When you interact with an opportunist, this module is constantly flashing red. Your brain intuitively understands that the social contract is being violated. This creates a subtle but persistent cognitive load. You find yourself keeping a mental ledger, tallying the times you gave versus the times you received, and the math never balances. This state of constant calculation prevents you from ever entering a state of flow or relaxation with the person. You are not in a relationship. You are in a bad business deal that you haven't figured out how to exit yet. Philosophically, this archetype draws us back to Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics.
Aristotle categorized friendship into three distinct types: friendships of utility, friendships of pleasure, and friendships of virtue. The opportunist creates a parasitic form of the friendship of utility. In a healthy utility friendship, like with a business partner, the exchange is transparent and mutually beneficial.
But the opportunist disguises their utility-seeking as a friendship of virtue, a deep soul connection. This deception is what causes the psychological damage. It makes you feel interchangeable. When they discard you because you are no longer useful, you are forced to confront the painful reality that they never saw you. They only saw the function you performed. It dehumanizes you, reducing your complex, beautiful existence to the status of a tool, like a hammer or a ladder, to be put back in the shed once the job is done. The reason we often struggle to cut these people off lies in the sunk cost fallacy. We look at the years we have known them, or the amount of energy we have already invested, and we convince ourselves that walking away would be a waste. We hope that if we just give a little more, they will finally reciprocate. But this is a gambler's delusion. The opportunist does not change because their strategy works for them. It maximizes their gain while minimizing their effort. By keeping them in your life, you are occupying space that could be filled by a friend of virtue, someone who loves you for your character rather than your assets. You must learn to value your own generosity enough not to cast it into a void. Closing the door on an opportunist is not an act of malice, it is an act of self-respect, a declaration that your kindness is a gift to be shared, not a tax to be collected. We now turn to a figure whose influence is often the most corrosive to your self-esteem because they frequently disguise their hostility as help or brutal honesty. The constant critic, the person for whom nothing is ever quite right. Unlike the cynic who doubts the future, the constant critic dissects the present. They pick apart your appearance, your manner of speaking, your choice of partner, or your career path with surgical precision. They often preface their commentary with phrases like, "I'm just telling you this for your own good," or "I'm the only one who will be honest with you." But if you examine the data of your interactions, you will find a distinct lack of balance. There is no praise to balance the critique. There is only a relentless focus on the flaw. They operate under a microscope of negativity, zooming in on the 1% that is wrong while ignoring the 99% that is right. This is not mentorship. It is a pathology of control. From a neuroscientific perspective, living with a constant critic is akin to living in a war zone. The human brain processes social rejection and criticism in the same neural regions that process physical pain, specifically the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. When someone constantly criticizes you, they are effectively inflicting microdoses of physical pain on you repeatedly. This keeps your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, in a state of chronic hyperarousal. You are constantly waiting for the next blow. This state of walking on eggshells is biologically unsustainable. It depletes your executive function, the mental energy you need for complex decision-making and emotional regulation. Over time, you begin to internalize their voice. Their criticism migrates from being an external noise to an internal monologue. You start to critique yourself before they have a chance to speak. This is the death of confidence. You lose the ability to act spontaneously or authentically because you are constantly pre-editing your life to avoid their judgment. Psychologically, we must understand why the constant critic behaves this way. It is rarely about you. It is almost always a projection of their own internal chaotic state. In psychoanalytic theory, projection is a defense mechanism where a person denies their own negative attributes and attributes them to others. The constant critic is often a perfectionist who is tormented by their own inner critic. They cannot bear their own feelings of inadequacy, so they externalize them. By finding faults in you, they experience a temporary, fleeting sense of superiority and control. It quiets their own insecurity for a moment to point out that you were the one with the problem. Understanding this does not mean you must endure it. Rather, it allows you to see their behavior not as a valid assessment of your worth, but as a symptom of their own suffering. They are vomiting their own self-loathing onto you. Philosophically, there's a vital distinction to be made between critique and criticism.
A true critique, in the artistic or intellectual sense, is an act of love. It is a collaborative attempt to elevate the work or the person. It asks, how can we make this better? It is rooted in a vision of your potential. The constant critic, however, is rooted in a vision of your defectiveness. They violate the principle of benevolent intent. If the feedback leaves you feeling smaller, paralyzed, and ashamed, rather than inspired and equipped to improve, it is not constructive. It is destructive. You cannot grow in soil that is constantly being turned over and examined for weeds. Eventually, the roots die from exposure. To reclaim your identity, you must distance yourself from this microscope. You need to surround yourself with people who see your potential, not just your flaws. People who correct you to help you fly, not to remind you that you might fall. We arrive now at a character who challenges the very architecture of your existence, not necessarily through malice, but through a relentless refusal to recognize where they end and you begin. The boundary violator. This is the person who treats the word no not as a decision to be respected, but as the opening move in a negotiation. They are the ones who show up at your home unannounced, who demand your attention during your working hours, who ask deeply intrusive questions about your finances or personal life, and who, when you attempt to draw a line, react with shock or indignation. They often frame their intrusion as closeness, insisting that we don't have secrets, or why are you being so distant? But this is not closeness. Closeness is a mutual agreement to share space. Boundary violation is a unilateral decision to occupy yours. They suffer from a fundamental confusion about the separateness of individuals, viewing your time, your emotional energy, and your physical space as an extension of their own property, available for their use whenever the impulse strikes. From a psychological perspective, this behavior often stems from a lack of emotional differentiation, or a phenomenon known as enmeshment. In healthy development, a child learns that they are a distinct entity from their parents, with their own thoughts and autonomy. The boundary violator essentially missed this developmental milestone. They lack a fully developed theory of mind, the cognitive ability to attribute mental states to others, and understand that those states may differ from their own. When they feel an urge to talk to you at 2 a.m., they cannot simulate the reality that you might be sleeping and that your need for sleep outweighs their need to talk. They are trapped in a solipsistic bubble where their immediate needs are the only reality that exists. This is not malicious narcissism. Sometimes it is a profound emotional immaturity. However, the impact on you is the same, a systematic erosion of your autonomy. When you cannot predict when your space will be invaded, your brain struggles to enter a state of rest. You live in a state of low-grade hypervigilance, constantly bracing for the next intrusion. The neuroscience of boundaries is deeply tied to the concept of safety signals. For the mammalian nervous system to relax and enter a restorative state, parasympathetic dominance, it needs to know that the perimeter is secure. If you have a friend or family member who routinely ignores your limits, they are effectively removing the lock from your psychological front door. Your brain interprets this unpredictability as a threat. You cannot focus deeply on your work, deep work, as Cal Newport describes it, or be truly present in your other relationships, because a part of your bandwidth is always reserved for managing the potential chaos they might introduce. Over time, this breeds a deep, simmering resentment. You start to feel like a hostage in your own life, and paradoxically, the more you give in to keep the peace, the less respect they have for you, because you are teaching them that your boundaries are permeable suggestions, not solid walls. To deal with the boundary violator, you must be willing to endure the discomfort of their reaction.
You must be willing to say, if you continue to speak to me this way, show up without calling, I will end the conversation, not open the door. You have to move from stating preferences to enforcing consequences. It is the only language they understand. It is a reclaiming of your territory, a declaration that you exist as a sovereign entity and that access to your life is a privilege that requires respect, not a right to be taken by force. We move now to an intellectual adversary who stifles the very essence of conversation and growth, the know-it-all or the arrogant. This is the individual who enters every room assuming they possess the highest resolution map of reality. They do not engage in dialogue, they engage in monologue. When you speak, they are not listening to understand. They are merely waiting for a pause in your audio stream so they can insert their correction or their superior opinion. They view every interaction as a debate to be won rather than a collaborative search for truth. Their certainty is absolute, unshakable, and often inversely proportional to their actual competence. Dealing with them is not just frustrating, it is intellectually suffocating. You find that your own curiosity is dampened because every question you ask is met with a lecture rather than an exploration. They suck the oxygen out of the room, leaving no space for nuance, for "I don't know," or for the vulnerability that is required for actual learning. Psychologically, this behavior is often a textbook manifestation of the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias where people with low ability at a task overestimate their ability. But beyond that, it is a defense mechanism against the chaos of the world. Uncertainty is terrifying to the human brain. The brain is essentially a prediction machine, constantly trying to anticipate what happens next to ensure survival. Admitting ignorance, saying, "I don't know," signals a gap in our predictive model, which can trigger anxiety. The know-it-all has developed a maladaptive strategy to cope with this anxiety. They hallucinate certainty. They build a fortress of dogmatism to protect a fragile ego that cannot handle the possibility of being wrong. To them, being corrected isn't just an update to their data. It feels like an existential threat, a small death of the self. This is why they defend their positions with such disproportionate aggression. They are fighting for their psychological survival. From a neuroscientific perspective, the arrogant individual is suffering from a lack of neuroplasticity. Learning requires the physical remodeling of neural connections, the strengthening of some pathways, and the pruning of others. This process is triggered by prediction errors or the realization that our internal model does not match external reality. The know-it-all has effectively disabled this feedback loop by filtering out any information that contradicts their pre-existing beliefs, confirmation bias. They deny their brain the signal it needs to rewire itself. They are in a state of cognitive stagnation. If you surround yourself with such people, you risk catching this rigidity. We rely on our peers to challenge us, to point out our blind spots. If your circle consists of people who think they have finished learning, you will stop growing by osmosis. You will find yourself retreating into silence simply to avoid the exhaustion of the conflict. And that silence is the grave of your own intellectual vitality. Philosophically, this archetype stands in direct opposition to the foundational principle of wisdom. The Stoic Epictetus gave us one of the most profound warnings in the history of thought. It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows. The prerequisite for wisdom is humility, the empty cup. Socrates was considered the wisest man in Athens, not because he knew everything, but because he was the only one brave enough to admit he knew nothing. The know-it-all represents the death of philosophy because they have replaced the love of wisdom, philosophia, with the love of being right. By keeping them in your close circle, you are anchoring yourself to a static point in a dynamic universe. You need friends who are fellow travelers, people who are comfortable with the mystery of life, who can sit in the unknown with you and ask, "What if?" rather than telling you, "This is how it is." To live a life of continuous expansion, you must distance yourself from those who have voluntarily cemented their minds shut. Finally, we encounter a figure whose influence is perhaps the most subtle because it is wrapped in the warm blanket of nostalgia and shared history, the stuck in the past or the keeper of the old version. This is the childhood friend, the family member, or the old colleague who refuses to acknowledge the person you have become today.
Instead, they interact exclusively with a version of you that ceased to exist years ago. They are the ones who constantly bring up your past mistakes, your old nicknames, your phases of immaturity, or your previous limitations. If you have worked hard to become disciplined, they joke about how lazy you used to be. If you have adopted a new philosophy of calm, they try to provoke the old anger. They act as the museum curators of your history, insisting that the exhibit remains frozen in time. They are uncomfortable with your evolution because your change forces them to update their internal model of the world, a task that requires cognitive effort they are unwilling to expend. From a neuroscientific perspective, this archetype presents a massive obstacle to what we call neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself. The brain works largely on associative memory. It links specific environments and specific people to specific behaviors. This is why a recovering alcoholic is advised never to visit their old bar. The environment itself contains cues that trigger the old neural pathways of addiction. The stuck-in-the-past person is a walking, talking environmental cue for your old habits. When you are around them, your brain involuntarily retrieves the neural maps you used to navigate your relationship with them. You find yourself slipping back into old patterns of speech, old insecurities, and old defense mechanisms. You might feel like you are regressing or acting like a teenager again. This isn't a lack of willpower. It is a physiological response to a powerful associative trigger. If you are trying to build a new self, surrounding yourself with people who only recognize the old self creates a state of cognitive dissonance that burns energy and slows down your metamorphosis. Philosophically, this brings us to the ancient Greek concept of the flux, proposed by Heraclitus, who famously said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." The stuck-in-the-past individual denies this fundamental reality of existence. They want the river to be frozen. They are committing an error of category. They view you as a static object, like a stone, rather than a dynamic process, like a fire. By insisting on interacting with who you were, they are essentially ignoring who you are. This is a form of invisibility. To be seen is to be recognized in your current state. When someone refuses to see your growth, they are invalidating your labor. They are telling you that your efforts to improve, to learn, and to transcend your past are irrelevant to them. They prefer the comfort of a predictable caricature over the complexity of a living, breathing, changing human being. The danger here is that we often conform to the expectations of those around us, a phenomenon known as the Pygmalion effect.
If people expect us to be better, we often rise to the occasion. But the inverse is also true, the golem effect. If those closest to you expect you to be the same flawed, limited person you were 10 years ago, you will unconsciously lower your performance to meet that expectation. You will dim your light to avoid confusing them. To live a full life, you need witnesses to your future, not just archivists of your past. You need friends who are excited by your potential, not comforted by your history. Sometimes you simply outgrow people. It is not an act of betrayal to leave them behind. It is an act of loyalty to the person you are fighting so hard to become. You cannot drive forward if you are staring exclusively into the rear-view mirror, and you cannot evolve if you are tethered to someone who loves the cocoon but fears the butterfly. As we reach the end of this taxonomy of disconnection, I am acutely aware that what we have discussed today is one of the most difficult undertakings in the human experience. To identify these archetypes is an intellectual exercise. To actually remove them from your life is a deeply emotional, visceral act. It often feels like a violation of our social instincts. We are evolutionary creatures designed for tribe, for cohesion, and for loyalty. The very thought of severing a bond, even a toxic one, triggers a primal alarm in the brain that screams unsafe and alone. You will likely feel guilt. You will wonder if you are being too harsh, too selfish, or too demanding. You might tell yourself that you can fix them, or that their behavior is just a phase. But I want to leave you with a reframing of this guilt,
one that shifts the perspective from cruelty to preservation. Consider the concept of Dunbar's number, proposed by anthropologist Robin Dunbar. It suggests that there is a cognitive limit to the number of people with whom one can maintain stable social relationships, roughly 150. But the inner circle, the people you trust, the people who influence your worldview and regulate your nervous system, is far smaller, perhaps only 5 to 15 people. This capacity is finite. It is a zero-sum game. Every seat at your table that is occupied by a cynic, a manipulator, or an energy vampire is a seat that is not occupied by a mentor, a true friend, or a source of inspiration. By holding on to the wrong people out of a misplaced sense of obligation, you are actively blocking the entry of the right people. You are creating a traffic jam in your social life where the vehicles of your growth cannot get through because the road is blocked by the wreckage of your past. We must also confront the fear of solitude that often drives us to tolerate these behaviors. We stay in bad company because we are terrified of the silence that comes when they leave. But we must distinguish between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the pain of being alone. Solitude is the glory of being alone. Solitude is the laboratory of the self. It is in the silence, away from the noise of the critic and the gossip, that you can finally hear your own thoughts. It is where creativity, stoicism, and self-knowledge are born. The philosopher Blaise Pascal famously said, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. If you constantly fill that room with people who degrade you just to avoid the silence, you will never meet yourself. You will live and die as a reaction to others, rather than as an origin of your own action." Ultimately, social pruning is an act of supreme responsibility. You are the curator of your own existence. Just as a gardener must prune the dead leaves to allow the sunlight to reach the healthy buds, you must cut away the connections that are no longer alive with mutual respect and growth. This is not an act of malice toward them. It is an act of love toward your future self. It is a declaration that your peace of mind is a non-negotiable asset. The people you surround yourself with are the single biggest variable in the equation of your life. If you want the output of that equation to be happiness, meaning, and tranquility, you must have the courage to fix the inputs. Walk away from the drama. Walk away from the cynicism. Walk away from the people who need you to be small so they can feel big. And in the space they leave behind, you will find something far more valuable than their approval.